Good afternoon. My name is Graham Boettcher and I serve as Executive Director of the Birmingham Museum of Art. I'd like to thank you for joining me today for my director's cut entitled Grand Tourists, American Artists Abroad. Now, before I get started with today's adventure, for those of you who tuned in on Monday, I want to say a little more about something I looked at then, which was the work by Iona Roselle Brown, with the young black girl on the big wheel tricycle. Although I am a trained art historian and have been in this field a long time, there are times when sometimes even those of us who are looking at art all day, every day, fail to see what is right in front of our noses and can misread or fail to see entirely an important element of a particular work. So I am particularly grateful for those of you who, over the course of the past, gosh, now it's 3 months that I've been broadcasting, have written to me either via Facebook Messenger or chimed in on the broadcast or reached out to me by phone or text or whatever vehicle you've used to offer your insights and sometimes your corrections. And I wanted to give a shout out to one of our amazing docents, Holly Watley, who watched the broadcast and afterwards posted on my Facebook page something about Iona Roselle Brown's work. And I'm going to turn, just to remind folks or to show people who maybe weren't there on Monday. So this is the work by Iona Roselle Brown, Kinkata 3, Peel Out, or a facsimile of the work. And it is inspired by a Japanese woodblock print from the 19th century of a woman warrior. And what I completely neglected to see or totally misread, I think I was misreading the massive blue in the background as a cloud and not making the connection that what appears to be a little tie or kerchief at her neck it's actually one entire mass, and that is, namely, thank you, Holly, a cape. It's a superhero's cape, which completely underscores the message of this young woman being a big wheel, being a superhero, a strong woman moving forward, peeling out as she leaves us all in her dust. So, Holly, for offering that insight, and if today people have similar insights, keep them coming. I'm always learning and am always grateful for people that are candid about what they see. Now, what do we see before us? We see a gentleman wearing a periwig that looks suspiciously like George Washington. We'll get to that in just a second. I'm gonna turn the camera back on me for a moment. Maybe starting today with Iona Roselle Brown's work is a good place to start anyway, not just to set the record straight about the fact that she, that this young woman is a superhero in her own right on the big wheel. But one thing that I did not mention about Iona Roselle Brown's work is, even though the work I showed you was inspired by a 19th century woodblock print, she looks at the flow of inspiration in both directions. She's not just drawing inspiration from Japan. In her body of work, she looks at the way that Japanese culture, contemporary Japanese culture, draws inspiration from African American hip hop culture. And that's a very, very important body of work that she has done. So I wanted to mention that she also works on issues of cultural appropriation, which are fascinating. And I wish we had some of those works in our collection right now, because one could easily build an entire talk around them. So I think if I didn't want to misrepresent her body of work, this is just one example, and it deals with a lot of rich issues, and as does the subject of today's talk, because in essence we're talking about the flow of influence, albeit in this case in 19th and early 20th century American art and where artists went for training and inspiration. We have to remember that the United States was a fledgling nation, declared in 1776. And so when many American artists were coming up, there was very little in the way of formal artistic training here on American soil. And so what did artists do at that time? Now we're going to turn the camera. They went to Europe. And this is going to be a bit of a walking tour today, so I hope I don't make you dizzy. Bear with me. But I think I've already discussed this work with you when I was talking about narrative painting and storytelling in American art. This is Benjamin West's painting, Erasistratus the Physician Discovers the Love of Antiochus for Stradinici. And I won't tell the whole story of the painting except to say it's essentially an image loosely based on classical history of a doctor diagnosing the love sickness of a young prince for his stepmother. Okay, so I'll just leave it at that. You can go back and listen to my previous broadcast for the whole story. But the reason I'm bringing this to your attention or back to your attention today is because at the time that Benjamin West was coming up, there really was no place for him to train in the United States. And so what did he do? And we're talking, this is in the 18th century, before we were even a country. This was painted in 1772, so 4 years before our Declaration of Independence. As a young man, he set out for Europe, and he went on what was called the Grand Tour. The Grand Tour simply means that it's bigger than the small tour. It was an extensive journey through Europe, but with some very distinct and favored destinations. As part of nearly any grand tourist journey, time in Italy was really a required destination, because Italy was home to so many works of art by the Renaissance. The Renaissance artists, by the old masters, a term that was often used, and artists would study the work of artists like Michelangelo and Raphael, and do sketches and drawings and paintings, copies after their work in order to hone and refine their own skills. That practice continues till today. When you go to Europe, and you make your way through the Louvre or through various, churches in Rome, it's a pretty frequent occurrence that you will see an artist copying the work of these so-called old masters, drawing sketches. I took part in a study program in Rome that was open not just to art historians and classicists, but to architects and artists as well, so that they could use the time abroad in Rome. This was a program run through the University to hone and refine their skills, and to draw inspiration from the hundreds of years of art history that came before them. And so this is still a part of artistic training. But early on, it was a matter of necessity. And so as a fledgling artist, Benjamin West made his way to Italy. And then he, remember, America was still a British colony. He made his way to Great Britain, settled in London, where it was oft remembered probably mostly by his rivals that he was an American. He was, especially during the midst of the American Revolution, I think that some of his fellow artists who were British were a little jealous of the fact that a colonist had risen to such a high rank in the land. He was the official court history painter to King George III, but he was also highly regarded ultimately for his skills as a history painter, and so regarded as a British painter, important British painter, although we claim him as American. So he's an example of an early American artist that made his way to Europe for additional training, but then stayed because the opportunities in London in the 18th century would have been far greater than what he would have come home to had he made his way back to Philadelphia, or even settled in Boston or New York or elsewhere at that time. So that's one early example. Now, because there were artists like Benjamin West who were American but ultimately settled abroad, in this case London, those artists provided a sort of home for other American artists that sought to work abroad. And I'm going to return to the painting that I started with, this gentleman looking very George Washington-like in a periwig. And there's maybe, well, it's if you look at this and see George Washington, it's maybe not coincidental. The individual that painted this work is none other than Gilbert Stuart, the early American portraitist that is responsible for the image of George Washington, the so-called Athenaeum portrait that was later engraved for our $1 bill. So each of us at some point has carried an example of Gilbert Stuart's work in miniature and in engraved after his original in our pockets or purses at some time. So this is a portrait of John Jones of Franklin, painted in 1785, and it connects particularly nicely with the image by Benjamin West that I just showed you, because this was actually painted in Benjamin West's studio in London. Gilbert Stuart made his way to England to train with Benjamin West, and this is one of the works that he did there. And John Jones of Franklin was an English naval officer, actually at one point after we acquired this work, and this was purchased in 2006 in honor of my predecessor, our former director, Gail Andrews, who had by that point served the museum many, many years. I think it was to mark her, if I'm counting the years correctly, to mark her 25th year with the museum. And of course, she served 11 more after that, if I'm counting right. But Gail, if you're watching, don't hold me to doing quick math in my head while I'm trying to talk about art history. But it was something that was purchased. She had seen the painting in New York at Richard Feigen Gallery, admired it very much, and then people set to work without her knowledge to acquire this for the collection, and it was presented to the museum in Gail's honor at a party honoring her service to this institution. So Gilbert Stuart, though, was working in Benjamin West. John Trumbull's another artist that went abroad for training, working in Benjamin West's studio in London. And during that time, he did quite a number of portraits of English naval officers. So after this was acquired, I had the occasion to go to London. I was visiting friends there, but always, maybe to my peril. Sometimes I try too hard to combine pleasure with business and get a little work in while I'm on vacation. And so I went to both to the Royal Maritime Museum out in Greenwich and saw other Gilbert Stuart portraits of English naval officers. And then I went to the National Archives to research the naval record of John Jones of Franklin. From what I was able to find, he wasn't a particularly noteworthy naval officer. In fact, I found records of ships that he had lost. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. I only had time to scratch the surface. But what I did find that was very interesting was more information about his son. His son proved to have a much more kind of lasting kind of lasting impact on English society. He was the individual that wrote the tract that put an end to the practice of flogging, corporal punishment, in the Royal Navy. And that was a particularly important bit of writing because it was later used in other social movements, the abolitionist movement, the movement to prevent cruelty to children, the movement to prevent cruelty to animals. And so his son's work had a lasting impact. Of course, that's just a footnote to this portrait. But it's a great example of how Gilbert Stuart went abroad to not only to have the opportunity to train and to take in the work of other artists, certainly all of the English portraitists that had come before him, but it also afforded him patronage that he may not have been able to find at home in the United States at that time. Of course, he did return to the United States where he became very successful, but I will say this about Gilbert Stuart. By all accounts, he was not much of a businessman. In fact, at the time he died, he left a great number of portraits unfinished. And were it not for his daughter, whose work I'm showing you here, this is by his daughter Jane Stuart, a portrait of Oliver Hazard Perry, which was purchased by our longtime friend Henry Lynn in memory of his nephew Gambrel Lynn, George Gambrel Lynn Jr., a number of years ago in 2011, if I'm reading that correctly, 2011. This is a nice complement to the work of Gilbert Stuart. It is a portrait of an American naval officer, namely Oliver Hazard Perry. We can see the Battle of Lake Erie raging on in the background, at which he distinguished himself, and it was painted in 1857. Now, the reason I say that, Jane Stuart was, why I bring up Jane Stuart now, were it not for Jane Stuart, after Gilbert Stuart's death, the family would have been utterly destitute. Gilbert Stuart, I think, was, I shouldn't maybe, kind of over-comment on the historical record. I don't know what was in his mind, but by his actions, I gather that he was a bit full of himself. It was claimed that he said that talent could not be taught and that he refused to teach his daughter Jane how to paint and follow in his footsteps. And so, thank goodness, Jane was undaunted by her father's, belligerence, and or obstinance, I guess would be a better. And she continued to sit in his studio and watch him paint, and tried her own hand at it. And when he died and left all of these unfinished paintings, which means if they were unfinished that they hadn't collected final payment, she finished many of her father's works and collected payment in full, and then became a highly successful artist in her own right. And this stems from a period when she was working as a well-respected, lauded artist in her own right. And this was a portrait of Perry that was originally commissioned, I believe, by Brown University as part of a gallery of luminary Rhode Islanders, because Perry himself is from Rhode Island, from Newport. Rhode Island is one of their favorite sons, so to speak. So just a little aside there. We do very much love these types of connections in our collection, where you can have the work of teacher and student, or father and daughter. There are a lot of these connections the deeper that you dig into the collection. Another painting that I want to revisit in this context is this work by Robert Selden Duncanson, entitled A Dream of Italy, 1865, which some of you have already heard me say, and forgive me if I say it again. I call this my deathbed painting, And I say this, and I know that sounds awfully morbid, but I say it because if someone were to ask me if I were to, die or God forbid get hit by a bus tomorrow, what have you, and someone were writing my obituary and wanted to know what acquisition for the BMA I'm proudest of, this is it. And I already shared that when I spoke previously about this. I shared the story behind how we acquired it previously, so I won't go too far into that, except to say that one of the things that I've tried to do is to build upon our strengths in this collection, and we do already have a sort of grand tour strength. This is a dream of Italy, and so I wanted to capitalize on this little vein running through our collection of American artists working and studying abroad. And I've also, though, looked to address weaknesses in our collection. And when I arrived, although we were doing good work in the realm of collecting contemporary African American artists, we were not doing as well with our collecting of historic African American artists. And there was quite a sense of urgency there, because the materials, many institutions were trying to address past deficiencies and prejudices in their collecting practices. And so there was a lot of competition for the existing works that were still out there available to museums. But I looked long and hard to find a Duncanson that was a perfect fit for our collection, that I thought represented his very best work. I really wanted a grand tour subject, but most of them were already in the Smithsonian, and this was one of the last major ones in private hands, and so it found a very good home here in Birmingham. Now, those of you who haven't heard me speak about Duncanson already, I'll just say briefly, he was the descendant of former slaves from Virginia, and he was born in central New York, but raised in Detroit, where his family owned and operated a very successful house painting and decorating company. He was not content simply to be a house painter. He wanted to paint fine art, and he sort of, initially bridged that gap. He painted decorative interior paintings, essentially painted panels for parlors or hallways. He made his way to Cincinnati, where he found a thriving artistic community, which he eagerly joined. He also found a community of wealthy patrons, many of whom were active abolitionists, and supported his becoming an artist and became his patrons and customers. It was one of these patrons who, Nicholas Longworth, who paid for Duncanson in the company of William Louis Sontag, another landscape painter, to make their way to Italy in 1853 on a grand tour. And so they traveled throughout Europe, and ultimately visiting another American artist in Florence, namely the sculptor Hiram Powers. And this goes back to the point of American artists who had become expatriates, like Benjamin West, like Hiram Powers. Their homes and studios often served as a haven for other American artists on the grand tour. Sometimes it was too much of a good thing. I mean, if you were an American artist traveling through Florence, there was no way, that you could travel through that city during Hiram Powers, residency there without stopping to see Powers. He was such a well-known figure and very greatly revered in artistic circles. There are other artists, such as John Gadsby Chapman, who was an American artist who decamped to Italy and really made his life and career there. And he loved to entertain fellow artists so well, and had such a steady stream of visitors from the United States, not just artists, but writers, politicians, you name it. And yes, many of them bought work from him to bring home as souvenirs of their grand tour. But he also spent a lot of money entertaining them, and I think it really put a dent in his finances. Too much of a good thing. That's John Gadsby Chapman, whose work we also have in our collection, but not up right now. But I want to, before we move on to another picture, I just want to walk us through this picture again, because one of the beautiful things about it, this is really a collection of memories of Duncanson's time in Italy. This was painted in 1865 when he was in self-imposed exile in Canada, waiting for the Civil War to end. As a free man of color, he was, I believe, desperately concerned at what would his fate be if the Confederates won the Civil War. And at the time he left this country for Canada, which was 1863, it was not yet clear that the Union would prevail over the Confederacy. And so I believe he had real cause for concern. So this was only painted at precisely the moment when it started to become clear in 1865 that Duncanson could return to his friends and his thriving artistic practice in the United States, in Cincinnati. And it is though painted in Canada, it is this really delicious pastiche of imagery from Italy, all parts of Italy. So you've got, the Alps, you've got something kind of, maybe reminiscent of Lake Como. You've got the hill country. You've even got the marshes. And so it's, everything you might encounter from northern Italy all the way down to Rome. And of course, getting to Italy was no small feat in the 19th century. It is, yes, there were people that came in by boat to major ports, Genoa, I think Livornia, which in the 19th century was called Leghorn, like kind of like Foghorn, Leghorn. I don't know why we called it Leghorn. I'm sure there's an answer there, but I confess I don't know it. But some people made their passage, through the Mediterranean by boat. Other people went overland, even through the Alps. And this wasn't, yes, it was, it certainly took longer and was rougher terrain to go overland to Italy, but it also afforded the opportunity to see other critical parts or critical destinations in the Grand Tour, which were the Alps. And, there is an entire body of Grand Tour painting that the sort of alpine sublime and these really magnificent views of peaks like the Matterhorn or Mont Blanc, and the Mer de Glace. So that's definitely a part of what American grand tourists hope to see at that time. Okay, so moving on around the corner, and some of these paintings, you've seen before, but I'm talking about them in a very specific context. I'm going to give a little shout out to John Singer Sargent. John Singer Sargent was not so much a grand tourist as an expat, and he spent the majority of his life abroad. He did come back to the United States occasionally, but he was really raised abroad and made his career abroad, though he was American by virtue of his parents, but he was on the move throughout Europe, and this was painted, as I think I may have mentioned previously. This is Lady Helen Vincent, the Viscountess de Avernon, painted in 1904, and this was painted while the Viscountess was in residence in her palazzo on the Grand Canal in Venice, Italy. And we see a little bit of the Grand Canal peeking out in the lower corner. All right, so turning our attention, I think it is. I would be remiss not to mention Mary Cassatt, an important American artist working abroad. She was born in Allegheny City, Pennsylvania, and then died in France. And she was among the just handful of Americans that not only worked abroad but exhibited alongside her, kind of French compatriots in the salons and major exhibitions in France at that time. So I would be remiss not to mention Mary Cassatt, and I think this is a particularly amazing example of her work. It is generally thought to be a preliminary study for a finished painting, which is in the National Gallery of Art. It's simply titled Elderly Lady in a Bonnet, Red Background. I have to say, and if I have friends from the National Gallery of Art watching, I'm not trying to, please, this is a personal opinion and you have every right to be proud of the painting you've got, but just a personal preference for me is the liveliness of the brushwork that we see in this preliminary study. To me, it's just fascinating to see how an artist builds up masses through brushstrokes and or even creates a kind of, in this case, a patterned or decorative background. And I'm going to get in close so you can really see what I mean. So this is a work I really enjoy looking at. I will also mention to you that this comes from the estate of a woman who was from Birmingham, but like the artist she collected, spent time abroad. And that was a woman named Mata Roden Kniffen, who spent time in the early 20th century. Her husband was the head of the French branch of the American company Colgate-Palmolive. So that is what took them to Paris initially. And they fled Paris basically on the eve of Nazi occupation and got one of the last ships out of continental Europe, leaving from Genoa. And so quite a tale there. But she was quite a dedicated art collector. I'm going to speak in just a moment about another work by an expatriate artist that she donated to our collection, or rather that came from her estate. So a couple other examples. I have already mentioned the sculptor Hiram Powers, who in the 19th century made his home in Florence, Italy. This is by a 20th century sculptor named Carl Paul Genuine. He was actually born in Germany, so the pronunciation would be Jenewijn, Carl Paul Jenewijn, but he made his home in the United States, born in 1890, died in 1978. He got the opportunity to study at the American Academy in Rome when he was kind of a young and upcoming artist. The American Academy, if you've never visited, it's a sort of magical place. It sits up on a sort of hill in Rome, surrounded by other national academies. And these are centers for the study of art and literature and archaeology that were established long ago to give nationals of other nations the opportunity to come to Rome, live there for a period of residency, and soak in all of the beauty and the history of that ancient city. And so Genuine was fortunate enough to have a residency in Rome, during which time he composed this work, Cupid and Gazelle, which was actually an homage to his newborn son. I believe the son's name was Paolo. So also, I guess the choice, Carl Paul Genuine, Paul became Paolo, a nod to his time in Italy. But I think you can see that there are some definite classical influences that this figure this Cupid-like figure that is representative of Paolo is influenced by the putti that one sees, the cherubic figures that one sees in Italian Renaissance painting, and more importantly, sculpture. And not just a Renaissance, but well into the Baroque and Rococo. So it's a very compelling work, and we are grateful to our friends Jim and Sally Johnson for purchasing this for the museum back in 2013. And it's had a happy home here ever since. And I want to get close. One of the things that distinguishes this work is the fact that it retains much of its original surface. It's cast in bronze, but let's see if I can get close enough to show you. It has gilded elements throughout, as well as polychrome. There are, let me see, it might be difficult to see and might not be on this side, but there are parts of the decoration that are painted in green and red in addition to the gold leaf. Another artist who is associated with time abroad is Thomas Moran. Now, Thomas Moran was born in England. There are a number of American artists who started their lives abroad, whether in the case of Genuine in Germany. Bierstadt was certainly born in Germany, in Solingen. Thomas Moran in Bolton, England. And then were raised in the United States, or came to the United States as young men and women, and then went back to Europe for their professional training, or for at least part of their professional training. So Moran is, very well known for his views of the American West, but at the age of 49, he became very, very infatuated with the city of Venice, and he painted it more than any subject during the last 35 years of his career. So whereas Moran started off his career being associated with views of Yellowstone, he was kind of Yellowstone's answer to Albert Bierstadt, who was associated with the Yosemite Valley more. During the last 3.5 decades of his life, it was Venice that most captivated Moran. And what's interesting is that the color palette is remarkably similar. If you look at his views of the American West, and then you look at the way that he was, captivated by these Venetian sunsets, he's able to employ very much the same golden palette with the rich yellows and oranges and reds and browns. And I want to read to you just briefly a passage from a letter that Moran wrote in 1888. He wrote, quote, "Venice is an inexhaustible mine of pictorial treasures for the artist and of dreamy remembrance to those who have been fortunate enough to visit it." So I love that idea, an inexhaustible mine of pictorial treasures for the artist. So it is a sort of gold mine in a way. These rich golden skies in particular, and this particular view, Moran is depicting the Grand Canal at sunset, and he's manipulated the composition so that two of Venice's most prominent landmarks we have, and these are the Campanile of St. Mark's Basilica and the domes of Santa Maria della Salute, so that they can be seen in a single view. I have checked, and I have Googled to see if it's ever been possible to actually see them from precisely this vantage point, and it's just not possible. He has deliberately manipulated the built environment to make it more picturesque, so that those two very important Venetian iconic landmarks can be taken in from a single vantage point. This is not unlike his fellow artist and rival Albert Bierstadt, who occasionally manipulated the natural structures of the Yosemite Valley to achieve a more picturesque result. So what you see is not necessarily what you get. There is this beautiful thing called artistic license, and isn't that a wonderful thing? All right, so I want to call your attention to a couple aspects of this particular painting. One is the way that Moran signed it, and you see he uses his monogram, which is the letter T, intersecting with the letter M, so it's TM, and then Moran, 1906, and OP.1, Opus 1. And we typically associate the term opus with respect to artistic production to musical compositions. And an increasing number of artists in the late 19th and early 20th century who were in many cases inspired by music, started using that term, which simply means work, to refer to their own works. So, another thing I'd like to mention, so this painting was given to the museum back in 2011. It was the bequest of Virginia Bissell Spencer. And this is a painting that Mrs. Spencer purchased, early on in her life. I can't think of the exact year, but it had lived in another Birmingham collection since it was purchased in 1906. And I'm having a complete mental block. Someone from Birmingham help me out here. The home on Highland Avenue that looks like the Donnelly house. It had been part of Mr. Donnelly's collection. I caught myself. It's like, I was like, okay, memory don't fail me now. It had been part of Mr. Donnelly's collection, and he lived on Highland Avenue, and he had double thick plaster walls in order to be able to support the weight of his paintings collection. So this was purchased directly from Thomas Moran's dealer, who happened to be in St. Louis, in 1906, sold to Mr. Donnelly, and then Mrs. Spencer, I think back at that time she was with her first husband, Mr. Bissell, so she was Mrs. Bissell at the time, and she purchased it then. And it is special because it retains also its original frame. And this is one of my favorite parts of that frame, that Thomas Moran, N.A. for National Academy, is molded right into the frame. I mean, it's so special not only to have a painting that has a history in this city since 1906, at a time long before, 45 years before there was an art museum, though there was a strong artistic community in this town. Even before the museum was founded. That's precisely why the museum was founded. But this is very special for those reasons as well, and special to have it now in our collection. Another artist associated with time in Italy is the painter Charles Carroll Coleman, and he was very, very well associated with the aesthetic movement. And he, like many artists of this period, and this was painted in 1901, he drew inspiration from Japanese woodblock prints and tried to achieve the sort of the harmony and minimalism achieved by Japanese artists of the 19th century, woodblock print artists. Coleman was born and raised in Buffalo, New York. Studied in Paris, and he eventually made his permanent home in Italy on the island of Capri in the Bay of Naples. And he found this wonderful property. It was a 17th century convent, which he converted it into his home and studio and called the Villa Narcissus after the Greek mythological figure who was captivated with the beauty of his own reflection. And from his studio window, and the title of this painting is From Studio Window, Isola di Capri, Island of Capri, 1901. From his studio window, he had a direct view of Mount Vesuvius. So this is exactly what you're looking at here. You are seeing Mount Vesuvius with a kind of mild eruption. Let's say it's he painted it in various states of eruption and dormancy over a nearly 60-year period. Now, most of these paintings are on paper. They're pastel on paper. This is one of the few that is oil on panel, and you can see that it is inscribed from studio window, Isola di Capri, October evening, 1901, and then his very distinct signature, which is the kind of ensnarled letters CCC for Charles Carroll Coleman, these interlocking letters. And then I want to show you its indebtedness to Japanese woodblock prints. And I'll do this by comparing it with this work by Hiroshige Utagawa, which is the Pine Forest of Mio, and it was from his 36 views of Mount Fuji from 1858, a woodblock print. And you can see, it has this vast expanse in the foreground, and then the peak in the far background, and then so it's pared down to very basic elements. There are, to be sure, more details in the foreground of the woodblock print, but compositionally, I think you can see that there's an undeniable similarity between this view of Mount Fuji by Hiroshige Utagawa and this view of Mount Vesuvius by Charles Carroll Coleman. Finally, I want to return to this painting, which I've spoken on briefly before. This is an important painting in our collection for a number of reasons. It is by Henry Ossawa Tanner, and it was painted in 1912. And it too, just like the Cassat, was the gift of Mata Roden Kniffen from her estate. And I mentioned that Kniffen lived in Paris before the Second World War, and we believe that there is a strong likelihood that she would have known Henry Ossawa Tanner from her interactions with artistic circles in Paris at that time. Tanner was born in 1859, but lived to the age lived until 1937. And given the circles they ran in, there is a high likelihood that they knew one another, and perhaps this was even purchased directly from the artist. I think this is important for, in terms of today's topic for a number of reasons. Tanner was both an expatriate and a grand tourist. He made his permanent home in Paris because of the obstacles that he faced due to racism in this country. At the time, he was born in Pittsburgh and trained in Philadelphia at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and he encountered daunting obstacles because of his race, which ran the risk of preventing him from fully realizing his artistic ambitions. And so he went to Paris to make his life and career there, and was extremely successful, and continued to exhibit in the United States at that time throughout his life, but also was highly celebrated by the French people, embraced as an artist, in their culture, and was ultimately accorded the Legion of Honor by the French government. So this is just one bit of evidence as to the high regard in which they held Henry Ossawa Tanner. In terms of this museum, this painting is very important for another reason. This happens to be the very first work by an African-American artist ever acquired by the Birmingham Museum of Art. It was given to us in 1971, a full 20 years after this institution was founded. So at this incredible moment of change that we are in the midst of now, I think it is important for those of us to use our knowledge about history to point out examples of institutional racism, and the idea that in a city with so many black artists for such a long period of history would not acquire the work of an African-American artist for 20 years, 20 full years after its founding, and 8 years after the repeal of Jim Crow segregation laws. I think it's important for people that don't already know that narrative to be aware of it. And this is something that, those of us in the position to build our collections are constantly mindful of and continue to strive for, making sure that the beautiful umbrella represented by this museum is large enough to bring many voices and many artistic perspectives to the proverbial table, but to the walls and pedestals of our galleries. One little footnote, and I think that you will know me by now well enough to know that I am a trivia buff and I love details. And just a little bit of trivia about Tanner. All roads lead to Alabama. There seems always to be an Alabama connection. And Henry Ossawa Tanner's sister, Hallie Tanner Dillon Johnson, was the very first female physician to practice medicine in the state of Alabama. She was the medical director for the Tuskegee Institute. She trained in Philadelphia and was invited by Booker T. Washington to take up the post, the newly created post at Tuskegee. He went with her to Montgomery to make sure that she received fair treatment by the accrediting body, and she received her license to practice in the state of Alabama and became Alabama's first female physician, black or white. And that's something, for those of us that are historians and value history. I wanted to mention that because I think it's just a wonderful way of connecting this great artist with the history of our own state by virtue of his sister, who made significant contributions here in Alabama. So with that, I thank you for joining me today. And please tune in Friday at 2 p.m. Central Daylight Time. I will be joined once again by a special guest, this time our curator of American art, Dr. Caitlin Crawford, who will share with all of us for the first time a show that has not yet opened to the general public because we'll still be closed until we see 2 full weeks of statistical flattening here in Jefferson County. May that come one day soon. But Dr. Crawford will be sharing with us the exhibition, Ways of Seeing Buildings and Monuments. Look forward to having her with us, and I look forward to having all of you with us again on Friday at 2 p.m. Meanwhile, be well and